Trade associations obviously won't disclose their donors. The fossil fuel companies obviously don't want to disclose their donations. Some donors are so determined to keep their identities secret that they launder their donations through anonymizer groups such as Donors Trust. Shell corporations can be used to obscure true identities. One simple question to start with: who funded this phony climate science denial textbook that the Heartland Institute published and mailed to thousands of school teachers around the country? It purports, by the way, to be from something called the NIPCC and to be a second edition. We know it cost a lot of money to print that. We don't know who paid for it. What instructions did fossil fuel companies give to front groups about opposing laws and regulations? And did that break the laws for nonprofit tax-exempt status? We don't know. How exactly did the fossil fuel industry deploy its front groups and trade associations to purposefully spread disinformation about climate science? We don't know. One of the top climate obstructors in America is the so-called U.S. Chamber of Commerce. How much money did the chamber receive from fossil fuel interests to provide these obstruction services? What was the deal? And what standard of due diligence did the chamber's actual board members meet about knowing what was going on? We could find out all these things and more. None of this information is privileged. All of it is amenable to congressional subpoena. Congress has a legitimate oversight interest in investigating whether fossil fuel companies are abusing 501c3 nonprofits to directly advance their own financial interests, or whether the fossil fuel industry has defrauded the public and policymakers about climate change, just as the tobacco industry did about cigarettes. Representative Henry Waxman's investigation of the tobacco industry was a fine example of Congress using its oversight powers for the public good. Of course, the fossil fuel industry's dark money control of the Republican Party makes Senate subpoenas unlikely now, but the time is nevertheless ripe for Congress to conduct thoroughgoing investigation into the fossil fuel industry and its dark money political operations. Republican senators are calling right now for the House minority to have subpoena power. If they'd give the Senate minority subpoena power, we'd certainly find good use for it. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses, and I want to express my appreciation to all the senators who've attended, and particularly to the chairman of this committee, who has shown incredible leadership through hearing after hearing, Senator Schatz of Hawaii. Thank you, Brian. And with that, Justin Farrell of Wyoming. Let me start with an observation, which is that there's sort of a cascade that has happened, a cascade into darkness with the Citizens United decision that opened up unlimited special interest money and the immediate recourse of big special interests to a variety of devices to make sure that they were spending unlimited dark money and had hidden their hands. But the third level of the cascade is that even if you know about the unlimited money spending, and even if you can get information about the unlimited dark money spending and dig that information out, the hardest part is to try to figure out about the conversations that took place powered by the unlimited dark money capability that these special interests have. The hardest thing to find around here is the small room where the lobbyist and the candidate met, and the lobbyist said, "We are coming after you. You are toast if you don't do what we say." And the candidate realizing that with millions, billions of potential dark money spending to drop, that is a very real threat. So I just, warn everybody that we may be able to get better clarity about how the dark money is being spent, and that will scare some of the cockroaches away from the light. They'll scuttle back into the corners a little bit. But ultimately, the threats that Citizens United enabled are the darkest part of this, and they're going to be really hard to dig out. Mr. Tanner, you've identified the Chamber of Commerce, the so-called U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and the National Association of Manufacturers as the two worst climate obstructors in America. Could you give us a few words on how it is that those organizations earned that distinction in your analysis? Other than by being awful.
It's the fact that they claim to represent the entirety of corporate America, and that's a very powerful mandate. NAM's record on taking advantage of the deregulatory dynamic under the current administration has been very, very effective. They have both have very large budgets, and the Chamber of Commerce, in addition to engaging in a lobbying activity, also has a foundation which provides election interference. So we judge their influence and importance based on consensus that these are hugely influential groups in Washington, and we look at their positions and the results of those positions on the various strands of regulations, which has been quite dramatic over the last 3 years, quite dramatic.
And the way in which they have been weaponized with electioneering funding and dark money, does that make them different than, say, Business Roundtable or other corporate leadership groups in your calculation?
Specifically, the Chamber engages in election issues and influencing that maybe is not present in the group you just mentioned. So I would single that group out as perhaps the most negatively influential in the United States.
Professor Oreskes and Professor Farrell, what have your observations been? What does your research tell you about the role of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in this unpleasant saga?
Yeah, well, as I think you know, Senator Whitehouse, I've been doing research on the history of the National Organization of Manufacturers, and they have been opposing regulation in the United States for over 100 years. Going back to debates over child labor, they fought to prevent laws to prevent child labor in this country. So this tells you something about what kind of organization this is, but it also helps to answer the question of why other companies go along with it. Because there are many people in corporate America who have bought onto the argument that regulation is a bad thing and that it's appropriate for these trade organizations to be fighting regulation. And so even though they may not be particularly concerned about climate change one way or the other, they will support NAM's anti-regulatory activities. And there's a very, very long history of that.
And if they can hold their nose with respect to some of the unpleasant regulatory work that NAM or the Chamber do, there's always the prospect that one day they'll need them to be their
exactly. I think
advocate,
that's right.
their bully.
Yes.
Professor Farrell?
A few papers that I published in 2016, I was surprised in my data the centrality of the Chamber. I didn't expect that in terms of being bridge builders, gatekeepers within that network, the network of denial, and then I think it was like 160 organizations. They were quite central.
Last question. Roughly how many organizations participate in this web of denial that you have described for each of Professor Farrell?
It changes, but I would estimate between 164 to about 200, depending. I think Dr. Robert Brule has worked on that and is always finding more.
So they can always move a new chess piece out onto the
right,
board.
Or they may shut down. Maybe it's a front group that sprouted up, that had some money, put out some flyers, put up a blog, website, all of that, and then they shut their doors. And so it does fluctuate.
Ms. Oreskes, the scale of the operation, same question?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's actually astonishing how giant this is. And just to give one statistic, so back in the mid-2000s, the Royal Society of the United Kingdom researched this question because ExxonMobil was presenting a lot of information that flew in the face of the scientific evidence. And the Royal Society is one of the world's oldest scientific societies. So they researched this. And just in the year 2005 alone, just ExxonMobil funded 39 different organizations that presented misleading or inaccurate information about climate change. So that's just one node in this network, and that was 39 different organizations.
Mr. Tanner, anything to add about the scope of this operation?
Yeah, I will limit my comments to trade associations, and we cover about 100 of them globally, of which about 30, 40 are in the United States. The common theme there is almost all are negative on ambitious climate policy, and so that's not true of the corporate population as a whole. You see a much more active, positive contingent, but it speaks to this outsourcing of the negative stuff to the trade groups. And that dynamic has to change if we're going to get anywhere soon on climate.
Particularly if the trade associations are the ones that are weaponized.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, let me thank all of the witnesses. Your expertise and your persistence and your courage up against this web of denial has really been something. It helps us a lot. You give us levers, fulcrums to work our levers from, I should say. And Mr. Rosenberg, thank you for your passionate advocacy for a strong role for Congress to help the American people get to the bottom and get to what Paul Harvey called the end of the story.
Let me just add one thing about persistence. If your committee and other committees continue to be persistent, one thing that the Waxman exploit evidences and what's happening now with the impeachment pressures, it will be people who will open up for those doors and come in, whistleblower types that will come and say, yes, here's what I heard, here's what we did, here's the paper, here's the conversation.
If we persist.
If you persist.
Good word to end on. Thank you all very much. This has been a terrific hearing. Thank you, Chairman Schatz, for allowing this to be conducted.